Hello everybody, welcome to Crafty Soup. My name is Misty. Let me tell you about today's episode. I have an idea stretcher video for you today, and we are going to be focusing on techniques using heat embossing powders. These techniques are great for card makers who are often familiar with embossing, but hopefully I have some ideas to step it up a notch. And I want you scrapbookers to know about these techniques too, because they can add wonderful texture, layer, and dimension to your scrapbook layouts. Now I am going to literally take just a minute to explain the basics, and if you know this part already, you can skip ahead to the first technique. Here are the supplies that we're going to be using: cardstock, something to protect our surface, a heat tool, but I have a fun tip on how to avoid that if you don't have one. You need embossing ink of some sort, your powders of course, and this little pouch is a powder tool, and then various tools to help clean up, keep the heat off of your fingers. Stamps are often used with heat embossing, but we're going to cover some other techniques. So you have your paper, you put that little powder tool on your paper that tamps down static so that the embossing powders don't stick to other parts of your paper that you don't want. You often use a stamp with your embossing ink to stamp some kind of image or word. Pour on your powder, tamp off the excess, and then you'll heat it up to heat set it, and that will give you shine, a bit of dimension, and color and texture to add to your projects. As we move into these first few techniques, we're going to alter up those supplies just a little bit. And the first one we're going to do is skipping that embossing ink, and we're just going to use water. I have a sprayer here, and you could just spray some water on your cardstock. I am going to dip my fingers in it and spatter my water because I like the texture of that better. And as you see me dipping and spattering, I will move my paper over to a coffee filter, which is my favorite thing to catch the excess embossing powder so that I can keep my table clean and then pour it back into the jar when I'm done with it. And I cover the whole surface. Normally I would put just a little bit of powder and tip it to cover the rest of my stickiness, but because this is water, the water can run and I didn't want that. So pouring the powder over the whole surface kind of helps set those droplets. And then you can heat this up. And quick tip, you'll want to heat this one from the back. We'll cover that more later. And set your powder and it'll be beautiful. So let's go ahead and move on to using glue instead of an embossing ink. And I am using a photo here just to remind my scrapbookers that yes, you can do this stuff with scrapbooking. And with the glue, like I said with the water, anything that has some sticky quality to it can work for holding your powders. Now with this photo, I am just using it as a template to draw a little frame around. I did temporarily tack it down so that I could move it out of the way when I do the glue. I drew in some pencil marks for this little doodly frame, and then I'm going to follow those pencil marks with my glue bottle, and that just kind of helps give me a guideline. Now I did forget to use my powder tool, which is a very common thing for me to do, and that can lead to stray embossing flakes here. And black embossing powder is notorious for having stray flakes. We'll talk about an alternative to that later. Here I want to say that you should probably let your glue dry because glue can bubble when it gets heated, and letting it dry can help somewhat with that. You can see that I did miss some gaps, but you can correct those, and I have some corrections for you at the end of the video. But basically you just add more glue and powder to fill in those gaps. Now here I am using this glue bottle to just do other doodles. I am writing some words, doing some squiggles, doing some polka dots. And again, I forgot to use my embossing powder tool there. Now these static powder tools come in various varieties. I like the little pouch just because it's cheap and easy. And basically the powder is equivalent to like a cornstarch. So if you don't have a tool, you can just use that. So I used my blue embossing powder, and we're going to talk about alternatives to colored embossing powders in a little bit, but that gave me some pretty little doodled shine on my project. That wraps up techniques skipping the embossing ink. Now let's do techniques that skip the stamping. So one way to do this is just to swipe ink onto your project. And on the left-hand side of this, I'm going to tip my ink pad and swipe down and kind of lift up at the end, and that is going to give me a frayed edge on my project. On the other side, I'm going to do a much more tidy technique, and I will mask off my edge and press my pad onto my paper, and that's going to give me a very bold stripe. So once you Once I add the powder onto these, you'll see the difference between these two techniques. I'm going to use gold powder a lot of the time just because I like gold, and it actually is more magical when you heat it because you can really see the change between the gold powder. Now see here, I did get some stray flakes on there, and one of the easiest things to do is to fix it before you heat it. And I do that with just a simple little dry paintbrush, and I wipe off as many of those flakes as I possibly can. Again, I'll have more tips on fixing things at the end of this video. So I add my powder to the other side, and when I reveal it, you can see that is a much lighter version, a much flowier edge version. So you can do either technique. Now, I did mention earlier with the very first technique that you can heat this from behind, and this is helpful because some techniques don't grab the powder quite as strongly as other techniques. So heating from behind can help start to set it, and then you can finish heating from the front or finish heating from the back. All right, so that is that technique as well as a couple of tips, and we're gonna go ahead and move on to another technique that does not involve any stamping, and that is using stencils. I love stencils with embossing powder, so I'm gonna use this very bold stencil so you can really see the pattern show up, but you can use any stencil. You could even make your own stencils with thin copy paper and punch shapes into your paper and use that as a stencil. I do find that stencils that are a bit thinner work best for this, but if you have thicker stencils, an ink blending tool can help get the ink through the thickness of the stencils better than doing the direct pad technique, but give it a try, play with it, and see what works for you. Because this is a big one, I'm just going to cover the whole thing with powder, and then I'm going to go ahead and heat it up. When you do have a large surface, it can be difficult to make sure you've got all your powder heat set. So when I tip it in the light, I look for any spots that aren't giving me that shine from set powder, and that way I know where I need to heat this project up a little bit more. And here when I tip it, you can see the shine that I am talking about, and this stencil technique is just fantastic. Also great for scrapbookers. All right, let's move on to pigment inks. Earlier, I mentioned that the black embossing powder is notorious for leaving stray marks. While I do own black powder and I do use my black powder, I know a lot of crafters prefer this technique. And this technique is using a pigment ink. Now, pigment inks, due to their chemistry, have a natural stickiness to them. Distress oxide inks, which I'm using here, are they're semi-pigment inks, so they will work for this, and they're very common and very popular, so you may have them already. And then instead of using any other color of powder, we are going to use clear embossing powder, and that's going to allow the color of your ink to show through. And this is that technique. If you use a black pigment ink, this is a way to avoid using that black embossing powder, which notoriously leaves behind those stray embossing flakes. So I'm doing this in multiple colors so you can see how this will show up in various ways. I've got my clear embossing powder here, and I'm going to cover everything. It won't pick up any of the color from the ink. It'll just coat that ink, and when you heat set it, now you've got colorful shine for your project. And you won't have to buy 100 jars of different embossing powders, just 100 colors of ink. That is one way to get a multicolor look. Let's talk about another way to get a multicolor look. And there's more than one way to do this particular technique that can get more complicated, but I'm going to keep it as simple as possible here. I'm going to start off with my sticky embossing ink and stamp down my image or word. I'm going to grab a spare sheet of cardstock and get my project set up, ready to go. And I'm just going to hold my scrap cardstock vertically across my image and sprinkle my powder on one side of that card. When I lift it, I'm going to shift it towards that powder to try and keep the line nice and straight. And then I can get myself cleaned up from this color so that I'm not going to end up mixing my colors, and we'll talk more about that in just a second. And I will set that aside. And then I will set up for my second color here. Now, because that sticky ink is already covered with that first color, you don't have to worry about blocking it off again. You can just sprinkle a little bit of powder onto your second half of your image. And I'm doing gold on one side and blue on the other. Carefully sprinkle that on there and gently tap it off, and that will prevent any of that gold from coming loose and mixing in with your second color, which here is blue. And when I get that all set up and tapped off, I am fixing any stray little marks. You can see that this powder did not get contaminated with gold. So I can save the rest of my powder and call this technique good. And we'll move on to the next one, which is an emboss resist technique, which is another way to add color to this heat embossing technique adventure. So I've got my paper prepped and I have my embossing ink here. I'm going to go ahead and stamp my project, and we are going to use either clear embossing ink, or if you're doing this on a colored piece of cardstock, you can use the embossing powder that matches your cardstock. That's not very common. This is usually done on white, and I'm going to use white embossing powder here. Now you will see a little bit later, here's the shine of that embossing powder. I had a problem with this technique that I'm not quite sure what happened, and I will mention that a little bit later as we get there. So I've got those same oxide inks out from previously, and I am just going to color blend these inks across this embossing powder. And the plasticky quality of embossing powders will resist ink colors. Now this will work a little bit better. I hadn't thought it quite through, but this will work a little bit better with regular dye-based inks just because they have more of a liquid quality to them and less of this creamy, sticky pigment quality to them, in order for that plasticky to resist the ink. Now here you can see it did pick up a little bit of color on that embossing powder, but if you buff it, that plastic kind of kicks into gear as a resist and helps that ink detach from the embossing. And you're left basically with just the color of your cardstock there. Now, as I tip this into the light, you will notice that my shine disappeared, and I'm not quite sure why. I have done this technique many times, but I usually use clear embossing powder and dye ink, so those might be factors. So I'm going to need to go test that out. But if you happen to already know this technique and this problem, go ahead and drop me a comment so I can learn from you. Our final technique is the most complicated, but also can be a lot of fun if you give it a try. And that is this faux wax seal technique. Wax seals are kind of all the rage right now. And if you don't want to add any more stuff to your crafty world, maybe you could do this instead. So I am going to do a free form seal, quote unquote, with just rotating my ink pad on my paper. And that's going to give me something generally roundish. I'm going to help that along with my little paintbrush here so that I can get it more round. I'm going to heat it up. I'm going to redo this just straight over that same spot 3 times. And you can do this more times and you'll get a deeper impression when we get to that part. But I find that if you do it at least 3 times, you can get some results out of this technique. So here I am with my 3rd coat, and I'm getting that cleaned up as much as I can. Before I heat it up, I'm going to make sure that a stamp is ready to go, and that's going to give us the impression of the wax seal. Now, I am using a rubber stamp here. I push it into my embossing powder that is nice and hot, and I'm going to leave it there until the powder completely cools. I do apply some pressure to get that indentation, and that is going to give us that wax seal look. Now, you can cut this out by hand, trim it, or just leave it as is. Now, I've only used red rubber stamps with this technique. If you stick with me, I'm going to show you with a new to me clear stamp version of this technique. But before we do that, let's go ahead and kick this up a notch with using some ink as part of this technique. So I have my stamp off to the right. It's already in the ink pad. I'm going to go ahead and make sure it's nice and juicy, and then go ahead and press it into your hot embossing powder. Now I find that all the timing and the kinds of ink and all of these factors can give you crisper or not results. So this one is really a technique you're going to have to play with to find what is going to work for you. So like I said, I have only done this with red rubber stamps because I know they can stand up to the heat, and I've always been worried about clear stamps not being able to stand up to the heat. So I'm starting off this process by testing it out on a clear stamp that is something that's kind of a duplicate in my catalog. And It's also an acrylic, so acrylic versus photopolymer could be an issue as well, and I will do both. Now I'm doing this one in a tidier technique where I'm using a round circle to create the base of my quote-unquote seal, and then I am pushing my stamp into this hot embossing powder. Now, I did give it a moment to cool and I didn't get a deep impression, so I'm going to go ahead and reheat this and that'll melt away that impression and I can try again. Only this time I'm going a little faster, pushing a little bit harder to try and get a deeper impression. And I think red rubber stamps also might work better just because they are naturally deeper than the clear stamps are. So that could be a factor here. So it's not the best impression, but it did work okay. And I'm going to go ahead and do this with the ink as well. And again, this is the acrylic stamp. We're going to do photopolymer stamp next. So here is the reveal of the inked acrylic stamp. And it came out okay. This stamp, when it is normally inked up, is a little smudgy looking. So that impression really isn't that far off. So now I'm doing this with my photopolymer stamp. And the very first try I didn't work very well. You can see a shadow of the impression, but not very much. So I'm going to try this again. I redid everything and I'm going to push much harder, and I'm doing it with my ink to see if, stacking up all of these combos gives me a better look. And it was better, but that was relative. I was worried about this damaging my stamp from the heat, but the stamp is fine, and the impression and technique didn't work. So I am going to keep playing with those techniques and give you an update perhaps in the future, along with some techniques that I couldn't fit in this video. Speaking of extra techniques, I have one bonus technique for you that's kind of based on something we did earlier, and that is gold veining. So as I was playing with inks with the other techniques on here, I always have leftover ink on my pad. So I'm going to increase that. More ink, some water. I'm going to smear my paper into this ink to get kind of a watercolory background. Now, because that water is wet, it will stick to some of this powder. So I'm going to purposefully pinch this powder and kind of rub my fingers together to release the powder onto the paper in very specific kind of pathways. And because this is an imperfect technique, you will get some natural randomness to this, which will mimic gold veining and like natural rocks and things like that. Now, my color palette isn't really natural rocks, but it's still pretty. If you use grays and browns in here, you could probably get kind of a granite or marble look. So have fun with that gold veining. And here is the spot for me to put in the last little fun fact / technique that I hinted at the very beginning of this video. Notice that I did heat this from behind. I found out recently that a lot of embossing powder techniques were done over a stove in the early days before these heat tools were available. So if you don't have a heat tool and you have, I would say, an electric stove, I'd be a little nervous to do this over gas. Go ahead and heat it with that and see if you can get it to work. That wraps up our techniques. Let's talk about some common problems and some simple fixes. So the first common problem is stray embossing powder, which I've mentioned several times. If you just have a few flicks here and there, you can just kind of scrape them off with a craft knife, and usually that is enough. But some colors like black can be pretty stubborn and leave behind smears and smudgy color streaks. So it's better to get rid of those stray embossing powder flakes before you heat them, and I've done that with a paintbrush tool in the rest of the video. So those are the best ways to deal with that. The next common mistake is when you've got your powders down on your project and you bump it and it dusts off some of the powder over your image. So here's what you're going to do in that case. Get rid of any stray flakes that are left behind, and I'm going to put those tips to use here with that paintbrush. And if you need to pull out that craft knife with a much sharper tip to get into narrow places, then you can go ahead and do that and try and scrape away any excess powder before you heat it. Then go ahead and heat it and set it. And once it's set, you can kind of see the shadow left over from the embossing ink, and we're going to fill in the gaps. This is a Versamark, which is embossing ink in pen form, and I have one of these on hand for techniques as well as for fixes. So I am going to draw over the shadow of the stamped impression with my pen. I will go ahead and sprinkle it with that powder. Now this first pass isn't very strong, and once I heat set that, I will go ahead and do a second pass. So here I am with that marker, and you can just use that marker straight over what you've already done there. And I will go ahead and powder it and heat set that, and we will have that first letter fixed. The second way to fix it is with the glue technique that we talked about earlier. Now you do want to be light-handed with the glue so that you don't get big, thick, heavy blobs. And keep in mind that both of these fixes are going to be a little bit heavier in texture and line width and those kinds of things than the original stamped image. But in a pinch, if you need to get it fixed, you can go ahead and do that. And as I tip it into the light here a little bit, you'll see what I'm talking about, how it looks a little heavier and thicker in those repaired areas. But overall, I think I've rescued that project. All right, that is the end of this technique video. If you have any techniques that I didn't cover or your favorites, any tips or tricks to share with the group, go ahead and leave us a comment so that we can all learn together. And I hope to come back in the future with an add-on because there are things that I couldn't get to in this video. So if you're not already subscribed, go ahead and hit that button so that you will catch any future fun that I share. Until next time, have an artful day.